Welcome, everybody. It's lovely to be here with you all again. I hope that you're going to find this case that I'm going to talk about today interesting. Today, we're going to talk about the case of Ainlee Walker, who was also known as Ainlee Labonte. So, for those of you who are new here, I'm Bev. I am a child protection lawyer. I've been qualified for over 25 years and I've got a background in both criminal defence and prosecution, regulatory law and child protection. And something that I'm absolutely passionate about is making a change for both children and women who are subjected to violence and abuse, particularly in a domestic setting. And I think if we can find ways to learn lessons from the cases that we look at, not just talk about them from a sensationalist point of view, then we might be able to make a difference as a community to the next Ainlee, and making sure that one child, even one, doesn't face the needless and senseless death that she faced. So this case takes place in Plaistow in East London. So here we've got a map which demonstrates exactly where this is, and you can see here lined in red, this is Plaistow. This is the River Thames that runs through London. And Ainlee passed away on the 7th of January of 2002, and at that time she was 2 years old and 6 months. So she had her entire life ahead of her. Her mum was Ainlee Labonte, who was aged 20 at that time, and her father was Dennis Henry, who was aged 39 at that time. But to understand what happened and how things ended up with Ainlee's needless death, we need to look at and understand the family and the societal dynamics in this situation. So we'll go right back to the very beginning and let's have a look at how this came about. So on the 7th of December of 1981, Ainlee Labonte was born. So that's Ainlee's mum. And when she was 15, on the 7th of July of 1997, she gave birth to her first child, who was a son. Now, that son was placed on the Child Protection Register when he was 17 months old for neglect. So there are various things that a child can be placed on the Child Protection Register for. It's got to be a risk of serious harm that can include neglect, physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse and sexual abuse. So it's got to be one of those things. And in this case, the son was placed on the register for neglect. And what happens is that a plan is made that hopefully will mitigate the risks faced by that child and allows them to stay with the parent or parents. Leanne, becoming a mum at that age, at 15, automatically puts her into the category of a vulnerable young person. And whilst I've got no evidence to suggest that this is the case, questions that would be raised in my mind when I'm looking at this from a legal perspective would be: who was the father? How old were they? Were they exploiting Leanne sexually, given that she became pregnant at that young age? And we don't know who the father was, so it isn't clear, but those are the kinds of questions that would be jumping out at me to ask of those professionals who had worked with the family. Now, Leanne didn't remain with the father of that original child, that first child. But in 1998, so just a year later or less than a year later, in the summer, she started a relationship when she was then aged 16 with Dennis Henry, who at that time was 34 years of age. So he's double her age, or more than double her age. And that raises red flags for me, even though she's over the age of consent. There is automatically a clear discrepancy in the balance of power in that relationship, given that she is a very young mother who is then in a relationship with somebody who is significantly older than her. And I would be asking questions around why and how she ended up in a relationship with a person of that age. What was the relationship like between Leanne and her parents? What was the dynamic between Leanne and Dennis? And in a relationship with such a significant age gap, where the younger person is as young as Leanne was at that time, the risk of domestic violence or coercive control being present in that relationship is significantly raised. And there are many more signs here that might be the case, and certainly we later learn that in fact it is. But it would automatically, already at that stage, looking at the history, be jumping out as a red flag at me that there is such an age gap. And I'm not suggesting that all relationships where there is a big age gap, there is going to be domestic abuse or coercive control. What I'm saying is that when a child of 16 is in a relationship with somebody who is double her age or more, then there is a real risk that there is going to be domestic abuse or coercive control in that relationship. Because a person who is 34, who is attracted to start a relationship with a 16-year-old person, is likely to be the kind of person who values that level of control over a person. And the next red flag is that in December of 1998, Leanne becomes pregnant again. Now, perpetrators of coercive control often use this as a tactic to isolate and trap a victim. So it can either be moving in together very quickly, getting married very quickly, or becoming pregnant very quickly early on in the relationship. And it's a way to exert control over that individual. You can't leave me now, we're having a baby. Well, you can't leave me now, you made a vow to stay with me forever. And so on. And then on the 24th of June of 1999, she gave birth to her daughter, which is Ainlee. And then on the 19th of July, there was an initial child protection conference. And at that stage, Ainlee was not put on the child protection register. The case remained open, so I would therefore assume that she was made subject to a child in need plan. So I'll just cover very quickly the difference between those things. So a child protection plan is a statutory intervention which is imposed on parents by children's services where there is a risk of significant harm to the child. And the idea is that that child protection plan can safely manage the risks to the child. It's developed between the parents and various multi-agency partners, and that includes children's social care, health and the police generally. And then others can and do become involved if there are other professionals involved with the family. A child in need plan is kind of the next rung down. So it's a non-statutory intervention. It's entirely voluntary at that stage for parents to engage with it. And it's used where the bar isn't quite reached for a child protection plan, but there are concerns about the child and their needs being met appropriately. And their needs are slightly more than can be met by the universal services that are available to every family in the UK. The plan's made with the same multi-agency partners as a child protection plan. It has goals and it's got steps that various people need to take, and that can be both parents and professionals. And it was obviously felt at that stage that Ainlee wasn't at such significant risk that she needed to be on a child protection plan, but she did have the benefit of being classified as a child in need. So she will have had access to more services and more support from children's social care. Now, in March of 2000, Ainlee failed her 8-month development check. So in the UK, children have a development check at 6 weeks, 8 months, 2 years. And the idea is that the health visitor or school health, when they reach school age, is checking to see whether or not a child is meeting their developmental milestones. And it was identified at this stage that Ainlee was developmentally delayed. And it isn't clear what steps were taken to establish why her development was delayed. And then in May of 2000, Leanne has another child, so she has a further son. And it was found that he was thriving and Ainlee was thriving, and children's social care at that stage closed their case. So they stepped it down from a child in need plan. And that essentially meant that there was no oversight by children's social care of that family at all. But less than a year later, in April of 2001, Ainlee was found by her GP to be not thriving. And at that stage, the GP requested a professionals meeting, which, quite bizarrely at that stage, her older brother was discussed, but Ainlee wasn't, which is really weird because she was the reason that the meeting was requested in the first place. So there's a clear failure of the process. It isn't clear from the notes whether or not it was the same GP who had requested the meeting that attended it. And that could be the difference. Maybe they've asked somebody else to attend on their behalf. But for whatever reason, Ainlee was not discussed. And that's a clear failure on the part of professionals. In August of 2001, there was a social work visit to the family, who at that stage were living in a second floor flat. The children were found to be clean and appropriately dressed, but the social worker noted that Ainlee was strapped into a high chair, facing a wall, and when they asked about why, they were told that it was a punishment for flicking food on the floor. The social worker expressed no surprise at this and failed to make eye contact with Ainlee. And that's a huge missed red flag of possible abuse. And you might say, why? They just sat in a high chair. And the reason is this. Children, particularly very young children, are often forced to stand in a corner, sit in a high chair facing a wall, kneel on rice facing a wall, and not move for an extended period of time. And it's something that perpetrators often have in their toolkit because it's very difficult for small children to sit still facing a wall. And so they're set up to fail and face more punishment because they're naturally going to seek some level of interaction after a short period of time. So it's this self-perpetuating cycle of punishment because they're setting the child up to fail at the task that they've given them by way of the initial punishment. It's a way of isolating and confining a child, and it's often a precursor to more significant violence later down the line. Still in the same month, in August of 2001, there was a domestic violence incident where the police visited. And the reports into this case indicate that there were 53 visits by the police because of domestic violence during Ainlee's 2.5 years of life. The father was the perpetrator, the mother was the victim. And statistically, even though men can be the victims of domestic abuse, statistically it is, generally speaking, the woman that is the victim. Particularly in the UK, there is a significant discrepancy in the numbers of victims who are male and female. And at that visit in August, the mother, Leanne, raised concerns about the children's safety. The father was arrested because he refused to leave the property, and they found drug paraphernalia in the home. But it's recorded that the police thought the kids were happy. So they arrested Dad. Likely he will have been given bail like the following day, for example. And that really isn't sufficient protection. But there's a huge learning point here, because the police have specifically recorded they thought the children were happy. So let's talk about what should happen when there is a domestic abuse call out and the police attend. So firstly, at every domestic violence call out, the police are supposed to complete something called a DASH, which is a domestic abuse, stalking and harassment risk assessment. It contains 27 questions, and the idea behind it is that it's designed to help the officer, who may not have in-depth training in domestic violence, to grade the risk to the victim and any children in the property. There are 3 risk gradings: standard, medium and high, and that risk grading should impact on what they do next, so what action they take. Had that been carried out properly and carried out by officers who had sufficient training in domestic abuse, they would have taken seriously the fact that the mother referred to being worried about the children's safety, and they would have asked questions to delve deeper into why. And the reason that they would have identified that as something that they need to delve into is because victims naturally often minimise the abuse and any risk from the perpetrator. So where a victim does voice this level of concern, then it should be properly considered and explored. And then in terms of the police noting that the children seemed happy, this is something that I see really often in police reports that come through to children's services following a domestic violence call out, and they come through automatically after every domestic violence call out. Children's services, if there are children in the property, will be alerted. But often the reports will say something like, children seen safe and well. It doesn't detail that they've had any kind of conversation with the child, which even with a really small child, they should be spoken to by the officers in a separate room to the parents to assess their well-being and to establish whether or not they're scared, whether there are any indicators that those children have been subject to abuse as well. But even if they aren't physically abused themselves, being in the same house where domestic violence is being perpetrated by one parent to the other is hugely harmful to a child. The long-term impact of witnessing domestic violence is very well researched and recorded, and it has a lifelong impact often. But on top of that, where a child has been regularly exposed to domestic violence, to police bursting in at all times of the day and night, they'll often be found sat watching TV or, just happily laying in bed with an outside appearance of they're quite happy, they've not been impacted. But I'd be far more concerned about that child than the one who was terribly upset by all the commotion. And the reason is that it demonstrates two things. One, domestic violence incidents have become normalised for that child. So it's happening on a regular basis. And we know what the harmful impact is. So we know that that child is being harmed on a regular basis. And two, the child is more likely to be in a state of shutdown or dissociation to enable them to deal with what's happening around them. Because otherwise, if they were kind of in the present, then it would be a really scary situation for a small child. It's also potentially the case that they've learned that getting upset diverts the attention of the perpetrator from the parent to them and they receive abuse, or that it winds the perpetrator up so the abuse against the victim parent is worse. So they've established that the safest course of action that secures their survival is to sit quietly and ignore what's happening. Which, when you think about a child kind of being locked in to this situation, locked into their emotions in this situation with, fights breaking out around them, police bursting in and sirens blaring, and them not getting upset, that is really, really concerning. And so that would heighten my perception of risk in relation to both the victim and the child, not lower it, because it demonstrates that it's a regular occurrence. And the police will have recorded that they've been out on the number of occasions that we talked about before, 50 something, I think it was. And what this does for me is it highlights the need for more in-depth training for police officers, frontline officers, so that they're better able to assess the risk at the time that they respond to these calls as the first responders. But let's move on in time. So we then jump from August to November. So there appears to be a period of calm after that incident. But Ainlee missed more development checks. So the social worker challenged Mum about her failure to get Ainlee seen by a health visitor. That was on the 1st of November. And on the 8th of November of 2001, the social worker raised the alarm regarding the high level of risk with her supervisors because Mum had been lying about Ainlee seeing the health visitor when it's clear that she hadn't. Now, later that month, in On the 23rd of November, the social worker contacted the health visitor and said, "Can we arrange to do a joint visit?" And at that point, the health visitor refused because the family was so dangerous. Now, this wasn't something that the social worker was aware of the health visiting service having recorded on their file, and it demonstrates that professionals weren't working effectively together. They weren't all putting their pieces of the jigsaw puzzle on the table about this family so that everybody had a clear, full picture of what was happening. And in almost every, not every, but almost every safeguarding review after a serious incident has occurred, this is a lesson to be learned, is professionals working more effectively together. On the 20th of December of 2001, the mother asked the social worker for an appointment. Now, it doesn't demonstrate in the records what that was for, but it also doesn't show that any kind of meeting was arranged. And we find out later, in terms of the review into this matter, that was related to the social worker being concerned about going into the family home because of the risks. On the 24th of December, so we've got Christmas Eve 2001, the police attended the family home because they'd received a complaint from the maternal grandmother about Ainlee being subject to abuse, and no further action was taken at that point. In less than 2 weeks of that, Ainlee was dead. Had the police acted appropriately at that point, Ainlee may still be alive. So, in Ainlee's short life, there were 55 referrals. Social workers said that they were afraid for their lives, and so because of that, they failed to intervene properly. Social workers appeared to be paralysed by fear. There were several failed visits, but then they didn't push it after that. And the last check-in with the family was in August of 2001. So we've got, quite a number of months have gone by since the last visit by social workers. And the referrals from neighbours referred to banshee screams and children crying coming from the flat. So the picture is quite a concerning one. But what happened next? Well, let's have a look at this beautiful little angel first. So this is Ainlee. She was 2 years and 6 months old on the 7th of January 2002. She was about as innocent and vulnerable as you can get as a human being. She relied on her caregivers for all of her physical, emotional and psychological needs to be met, and she wasn't yet in school, so she didn't have that oversight either. She had her entire life ahead of her. She was a beautiful, charismatic little girl who could have been anything and done anything that she chose. And one of the main questions that social workers are supposed to ask is, what is the daily lived experience of this child? So what's their everyday like? The answer for Ainlee was essentially awful. She was denied her basic needs, including food. She was subjected to consistent, ongoing abuse by those who ought to care for her and love her the most, and who were supposed to keep her safe. And on the 7th of January 2002, whilst most people were sitting at home, setting their New Year's resolutions, maybe returning to work or school after the Christmas holidays, Ainlee lay unresponsive on the kitchen table whilst her parents called 999. When the paramedics responded, it was too late. Ainlee's life couldn't be saved. A post-mortem was carried out which found that she was 21 pounds, so that's about half of the average weight for a child of her age. She had 64 scars on her body, and her body was riddled with abuse. And the medical examiner described her as resembling a famine victim. She was starved and tortured by her parents. So what happened? Both mum and dad were arrested at the hospital, because obviously the hospital will have notified the police as soon as they see a child admitted in that state. They were both convicted of manslaughter, and Leanne was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and the dad was sentenced to 12 years in prison, which seems absolutely pitiful when you think that Ainlee suffered pretty much most days of her 2.5-year life and lost her life at that age because of their actions. There was an inquiry, and the findings were that there were failures in communication. So we talked before about, that's usually one of the findings of these inquiries, is that there's been a lack of proper communication between professionals that are involved in the case. Professionals were intimidated by the carers and chose not to go into the family home because of concerns for their own safety, but didn't follow proper procedure, which is that where there are aggressive parents or risks to the safety of a social worker or health visitor, they ought to go back with police where necessary. In this case, that did not happen. And so for a 6-month period, professionals didn't have any eyes on Ainlee. They didn't know what was happening. And if they can't see her, then they can't see the signs of abuse. The recommendations after the inquiry were that there was a call for the end of the defence of reasonable chastisement. So that is something that the parents said they were only chastising Ainlee and they didn't intend to cause her death. That there should be the appointment of a National Children's Commissioner who would act as a watchdog, highlight failings, review government legislation, and ensure that everything possible was done wherever a child dies to learn from that and avoid it happening in the future. And the report refers to the fact that other countries have clearly benefited from having a watchdog that's got teeth behind it. So just being able to put out a report isn't enough. If there have been failures within the various professional organisations, then there needs to be a sanction, accountability for those organisations. And after this case, there were new child safeguarding teams set up across the country. The idea was that they would draw together the different professions who would work under one roof, so that would avoid this lack of communication between professionals because they'd all be sat essentially in one room. And they were, at the initial time that they were set up, called the MASH, so that's the Multi-Agency Safeguarding Hub. They're now often called by a variety of names. It's not consistent across the various authorities, but the concept remains. That being said, the cultural issues around sharing information, what you can and can't safely share between organisations, still remains, even though we have these safeguarding hubs. So it may be that the initial conversations when a referral comes in happens, and the police who are in that hub will give information across and kind of let the social workers know what is recorded about the parents and the family on the police national computer. But later down the line, where there's a need for more information to be shared, that's where we now hit roadblocks, unfortunately. Liz Atkins from the NSPCC, when this report came out, said this: "Child protection is everybody's concern. We must not just ignore a child." And that holds true for professionals and for members of the community. Now here there were 55 referrals, so people were actually doing what they needed to do in terms of making those referrals in. The failure appears to be on the part of the professionals who were receiving those referrals in acting appropriately. But I think it's important that we all take collective responsibility for protecting every single child in our community. They all deserve our protection. And it's something that I'm really passionate about, is that it takes a village to raise a child. And the families where there's a high risk of children being mistreated, it's generally because of, not always, but it is contributed to by socioeconomic status. So you tend to find that it's families in poverty where there is high stress levels due to money concerns, there is mental health issues, there is substance misuse issues, and there is domestic violence. So the domestic violence, mental health and substance misuse, that's called the toxic trio, and professionals refer to that as a high risk family where that toxic trio is present. So you're far more likely to find that a child is at risk of harm in those environments. And so they take more monitoring and more support. But here, unfortunately, that didn't happen. So that is the sad case of Ainlee Walker. And I hope that... So that's it for now, folks. Thanks for watching. Please take a minute to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss any future videos that I put out. I am hoping to get a little bit more consistent and do at least one case per week, preferably two if I can manage that, but certainly one. Let me know what you thought about Ainlee's case and the things that we can learn from that. If you've got anything else to add about the analysis and anything that we need to look at that I didn't mention, please put that in the comments. And let me know if there's any other cases that you'd like to hear about. Let's keep our eyes and ears open, and if we see something, act on it. Let's make a difference for the next Ainlee. It just remains to say, please take care of yourselves and each other, and I'll see you next time.